It's curious how many transformations a person can undergo in one lifetime. Some are physical, lines deepening in the face, hands losing their nimbleness. But others happen within, shaped by circumstances, disappointments, or unexpected joys. People often don't notice these changes, yet they continue to evolve, sometimes into a person far removed from who they once were. Margareth was just 19 when she first saw Luis. Dreamy, romantic, and full of youthful optimism, she fell for him instantly. His charm and attentiveness swept her away, and before long, she was sure she had found her prince, the one who would turn her life into a fairy tale. But every prince has a queen, and his mother, old Mrs. O'Leary, was no queen of kindness. After they married, Margareth and Luis moved into the O'Leary family home, a two-story building with their grocery shop on the ground floor. And there, amidst the clinking of jars and the rustling of paper bags, Margareth's nightmare began. Mrs. O'Leary, with her sharp tongue and cold eyes, never hid her disapproval of Margareth. No matter how hard she tried to win her mother-in-law's approval, it was never enough. Her cooking was never quite right. Her cleaning was not thorough enough. Luis tried to shield her from the daily criticisms, but his efforts were futile. The tension between the two women was ever present, like an unspoken storm. Sometimes Margareth would catch Mrs. O'Leary staring out the window, a strange sadness in her eyes. It flickered for only a moment, but it lingered with Margareth, raising questions she never dared to ask. Margareth begged Luis to move out, to start their own life away from the oppressive air of his mother's judgment. But he couldn't leave. His mother was widowed and sickly, and she needed help running the shop. So they stayed, and Margareth endured. The birth of their first child, a daughter, should have been a joyful event. But Mrs. O'Leary had hoped for a grandson, and her displeasure only grew. Margareth, tender and soft-spoken, felt herself wilting under the weight of it all. Yet, after the birth of their second child, a son, Margareth realized even this wasn't enough to melt her mother-in-law's heart. And in that moment, something inside Margareth shifted. She had brought two children into this world. She had rights too, she thought. It wasn't fair that her every step was scrutinized and criticized. Gradually, she learned to stand her ground, to push back when Mrs. O'Leary overstepped. It wasn't a war, but their relationship became rigid, formal, and dry. Years passed like this, until one day, Mrs. O'Leary fell gravely ill. Despite their history, Margareth took care of her in her final days, not out of love, but out of duty. In one quiet moment, Mrs. O'Leary squeezed her hand, her eyes soft with something that might have been regret, though she never spoke it aloud. When the old woman finally passed, the house felt eerily quiet. For the first time in years, Margareth had space to breathe, to think, to be. But life has a way of cycling. Not long after, their youngest son, Rob, and his wife, Linda, moved into the house temporarily to save money for their own home. At first, things were smooth, but soon, Margareth began treating Linda the same way Mrs. O'Leary had treated her. Harsh criticisms, coldness, and unyielding expectations. Rob tried to reason with her, but she couldn't seem to stop. Her bitterness had taken root. Then, one day, Rob exploded. "I'd rather pay rent somewhere else than live in this toxic house," he shouted, packing up their things. He and Linda moved out soon after. Some days later, a huge storm raged outside. Luis sat quietly at the kitchen table, watching Margareth complain about the day's customers. "In weather like this, why don't they stay home? If it weren't for that man buying red apples, we could have closed half an hour earlier." Luis remained silent for a long time, staring at his wife. "It's the barley boy," he finally said. "His wife's pregnant, and those are her favorite apples." Margareth waved it off. "Whatever. I didn't bother anyone when I was pregnant." Luis sighed deeply. "I can't do this anymore, Marge. I never wanted to marry my own mother." Margareth stiffened. "Excuse me? You've become just like her. That strict, cold woman I never wanted you to become like. I can't handle the constant anger and complaining anymore. I'm moving in with my friend for a while tomorrow." Margareth hesitated. She had seen it coming, their recent silences, his distance, but hearing him say it out loud hit her harder than expected. "Do we have to go on like this?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "I never meant to turn into her." Louise's eyes softened briefly. "Then why don't you stop? Why don't we stop?" She stared at him, unsure how to answer. But the next morning, Louise was gone. Standing alone in the empty house, Margareth felt something she hadn't felt in years. Grief. Not just for her husband, but for herself. She realized that somewhere along the way, she had lost the soft, kind-hearted girl she once was. The girl Louise had fallen in love with. She wept for everything she had lost. Her dreams, her joy, her sense of self. Later that day, she found herself at the cemetery, sitting by Mrs. O'Leary's grave. Margareth remained silent, feeling the weight of the years. She wasn't sure why she had come here, but deep down, she sensed that something needed to be said, something that could only be spoken in this place. At first, her thoughts were scattered, frustration, sadness, anger, all swirling together. Then, unexpectedly, she found herself thanking Mrs. O'Leary, her voice quiet but steady. She thanked her for the advice, for helping with the children, for the lessons in running the business, and even for her harsh discipline. As the words flowed out, a surprising realization dawned on her. If all those years of pressure had turned her, Margareth, into such a joyless person, what kind of life had Mrs. O'Leary lived to become the way she was? The thought hit her with force. Empathy washed over her, and for the first time, she felt deep pity for the old woman who had made her life so difficult. Mrs. O'Leary must have endured a harsh, loveless existence herself. Tears streamed down Margareth's face as she imagined the burdens the old woman had carried. She wept not only for herself, but for Mrs. O'Leary, for the shared pain neither of them had ever spoken about. Margareth sat there crying the whole day, but by the time the sun began to set, a strange sense of lightness filled her heart. She had let go of the bitterness, and in its place, there was a fragile but hopeful peace. Margareth returned home lighter that evening, a small piece of her old self having reawakened. The next day she went to Rob's house with a cabbage pie, Mrs. O'Leary's recipe. She apologized to him and Linda, asking them to return. Rob, skeptical, hesitated. "Why would things be different now?" he asked. Margareth smiled softly. "Because I've changed, and I'm trying to make things right. You'll see." They did return, cautiously at first, but Margareth, determined not to repeat her mistakes, focused on rebuilding her relationships, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of kindness. Slowly, her face softened, her laughter returned. She didn't chase after Louise, but let him see the change in her, knowing trust had to be earned. Weeks later, she found herself visiting the cemetery more often, reflecting on her life. One day, she ran into Louise there, standing quietly by his mother's grave. They sat together and talked. Louise was surprised to learn that Rob and Linda had already moved back into the house, living peacefully for over a month. Touched by Margareth's transformation, he paused, then asked gently, "Do you think I could come for a family dinner one day?" Margareth nodded, smiling softly. As they left the cemetery, they parted ways, but she knew that everything would be all right.